Welcome to my narrated transparent watercolor tutorial, Spring at Furnace Run. The painting on the right was a reference and inspiration for this painting. I took the photograph from the bank of a stream called Furnace Run, and it was the day after some heavy rains, so as a result the water was flowing pretty strong and it was turned up and very muddy. I knew before I started my painting that there were some problems I was going to have to solve. In the reference photo, there's a lot of textural qualities and a lot of highlights, and I had to decide before I began my painting how I was going to deal with those and give the suggestion of all those textures and highlights. Secondly, when you look at the photograph and you see the rocks that are very near you, and then the trees which are a little farther away, and then the distant shoreline, there's a strong sense of a foreground, middle ground, and background. So I have a decision to make on how I'm going to approach my painting to create basically these layers of the background coming forward to the middle ground, coming forward to the foreground. And the third problem that I felt that I needed to come up with an answer for before I began my painting had to do with the muddiness of the water. The kind of murky, muddy green isn't really what I wanted to convey in my painting. I wanted to have more of a reflection of sky and a bluish water that people tend to connect with when they think of water flowing in a stream. So to solve these problems, I decided first that the most efficient way for me to deal with all the textural qualities and highlights would be to do an extensive amount of masking up front using masking fluid. Secondly, in order to achieve a strong sense of foreground, middle ground, and background, I decided I would approach this by layering, starting with the farthest layer first and begin moving forward. And to solve the third problem, to deal with the muddiness of the water, I decided that I would simply begin by putting a blue wash over the area that would bring a fresher blue water look to my composition. I'm going to begin here at a point where I've already done some masking and I'm continuing to apply masking fluid. But I've done a lot of masking in an area that's mostly the middle ground. There's a lot of overlapping shapes in that middle ground that overlap the background, and a lot of them are going to be lighter valued. So to preserve those areas, I've applied masking fluid over branches, twigs, and leaf shapes so that I can put a wash over the background, remove the masking fluid, then I can put some light washes in those areas where I preserve to represent leaves and branches. So it's an efficient way for me to achieve that layering effect and get the textural qualities that I'm after. Here I'm continuing on masking off some of the branches and twigs that are very dense in the upper portion of this composition. Sometimes when I'm using this fine liner masking fluid pen, it'll start to, maybe after a while, it'll start to feel like the flow is starting to get blocked a little bit and isn't as fluid as it was when I started. So I'll just stop and I'll take the cap and the wire of the cap and I'll insert it in it and close it all the way, screw the cap down, and then I'll pull it back out, and that normally helps clear the nozzle a little bit so that the masking fluid continues to flow at a decent rate. You do have to be careful with these. If you're going to take a break, you don't want to leave it with the cap off because it will dry up and clog very quickly. Next, I'm going to dip a toothbrush into a jar of masking fluid pen and just flick the bristles to get some splatter, and then I'll just tap it on my hand to get some splatter of the masking fluid. It just brings a kind of a sparkle of light throughout the composition. When you do use a toothbrush or a regular paintbrush or anything with masking fluid, you want to put some a mild soap on it first. That will help it clean up afterwards. Now, I've applied masking fluid in a variety of ways across the whole composition, and for me it's an efficient way to get the textural qualities I'm after and build some of the layers that I'm after with light values on top of dark values. Now, some people prefer not to use masking fluid, which is fine. You have to use the techniques that you feel comfortable with or ones that are going to give you the result that you're after. I find this is an effective technique for me, and I don't use masking fluid in many of the paintings I do, but when I'm doing sometimes landscapes or snow scenes, I find it to be a very effective process and gives me the result I'm after. The last area that I'm going to put some masking fluid is in the water to preserve some of the highlights on the water that are created by the ripples. So the one thing that's a little different about this versus the branches and the leaves is the leaves and the branches are somewhat random on my marks, and these a little bit more deliberate, and they create a pattern because a lot of these highlights they run parallel to one another, and as a group they indicate where the ripple of the water is. So it's a little different than just randomly putting down the branches and the leaf shapes. Before I start painting, I'll do a quick review of the paints that I used. The light green mixture in my painting is cadmium yellow light and permanent green #1 is called. And I use this mixture here to give me a nice bright fresh green color. That's very much a yellow green. Now to give it more of a less yellow green and more green, I've added a little hooker's green, and it needs just a little bit more water, but it's kind of a raw green, but the two of these work together to represent the highlighted areas that are kind of sunlit in my composition. So I've used cad yellow light, permanent green #1, and hooker's green, and those are giving me my bright greens. Now I'm going to take a little pyrrole red and mix it into the green mixture, add a little bit more hooker's green, and that gives me a nice darker value neutral green that I can use in shadowed areas, and I can use it alongside these brighter greens to make them stand out more and be more vibrant. So here's a mixture that I use throughout the painting on rocks and trees and limbs and ground, and this is raw sienna, and I'm also taking ultramarine blue, and I'll mix those two together to give me some warm neutrals, some cool neutrals, and some darker values leaning towards blue in some of the areas in the composition, and then I'll warm it up also. But you can see there I kind of have a gray, a bluish tone, a warmer tone that's leaning more towards raw sienna. But it's a variety of colors I can use throughout the composition. Now if I take some royal blue, that gives me even a darker value. It's very cool and neutral. If I add some more raw sienna to it, it changes it a little bit more. So there's a rather cool dark value neutral. It's almost a neutral gray. And if I take some alizarin crimson, mine is alizarin crimson quinacridone, and mix it to that, I'll start to warm it up. I'll go back and forth till I get the balance that I want. But that starts to give me a warmer dark value. So right there in that corner on my palette, you can see I have a warm dark value, a cool dark value, some middle values, depending on how much water I add to it. I mean, these can all be middle values. You'll see here as I take this a warmer dark value, and I'll grab this cooler one, put them side by side. You can see the difference in the two. But it's all just a small pool of colors that I'm using. The next color I'm using is called peacock blue. It's a Holbein color. I really don't use it a lot, but it's a mixture of two pigments, PB15 and PG7. PB15 traditionally used for phthalo blue or Windsor blue, and PG7 is used for phthalo green. So it's a bit of a blue-green tone. And right next to it I've mixed raw sienna and cobalt blue, and that's going to give me this kind of a neutral earthy green tone that I'm also going to use for the water to put over top of this blue glaze that I'm going to put down. So I've applied my masking fluid and it's thoroughly dry. And it's taken a while to do this, but it's just as important as the painting that I'm going to do. If you're going to take this approach and use this technique, I tend to think of it as painting without the brush, because it's that preparatory work that just allows me to come in and put down the big washes that I want to put down and keep the detail in the other areas. I've begun to put down a wash of peacock blue, and I have my darker value at the bottom, and then I'll take water and gradate it upwards. And this is my answer to my third problem, which was how to do this painting without having just the kind of muddy, murky water. So this is the my answer to that is beginning with this blue glaze, which I'll paint over top of with some more neutral tones. But this is where I'm going to get my start for this. And when I'm done, this blue will come through in areas and give me that look that I'm after. Now I'll begin painting these darker value tree shapes. And this is my mixture of raw sienna, ultramarine blue, and some of it with royal blue, and some of it with alizarin crimson. But basically mixtures that come up with the warm and cool neutral colors. And you can see as I put this down how that masking fluid will preserve those shapes going across the trees, and it helps create the overlap that I'm after. And this is a raw sienna that I'm putting in here, which is obviously a much warmer tone than the cool gray that I put down to begin with on the trees. And I painted those with a fairly big brush. This is my Silver Black Velvet Jumbo Round Small. It's a brush I like to use in landscapes a lot. And just starting to paint some of the shadowed areas and the rocky portions of my composition. So I've continued to paint the rocks, and I've worked in a green tone there, kind of represent the mossy rocks there using some of the green, and I've mixed in some raw sienna with it to give it more of an earthy tone. Now I'm applying this earthy green tone over top of the blue that I had put down, so that'll give me that blue highlight in the water that I was looking for, and it'll still keep some of the earthy green color that's in the photograph, so it's kind of a happy medium in between the two. So this water is really going to be described by three layers: the blue wash that I put down to begin with, the earthy green tone that I'm putting over top, and then the area where I put the masking fluid, it's going to save the whites. So I'll have the blue, the earthy green, and the white highlights are the three layers that are going to describe this stream. I'll continue taking this back a little bit here, getting in between the trees. And there's highlighted areas throughout that whole area that are preserved by the masking fluid. So now I'm putting a warm tone on the distant shoreline to describe that kind of muddy edge over there. and I soften it with by blotting with a tissue. And I'm going to take some of that same tone and I'm going to move it up into some other areas of my painting. That's one of the nice things about when you're developing your painting as a whole. You tend to move around with one color, and it starts to provide some harmony across your whole composition, and it feels like one piece that you've developed as a unit rather than individual pieces. So far I've been little by little developing some larger shapes in my painting, and I'm going to continue that by starting to come in with my bright greens, a mixture of cad yellow light and permanent green #1. And here I'm still using the same brush and just very generous with my application of the wash. But really what I'm doing is just blocking in large areas of color, and that's what I've done so far. The blue area, the neutrals that I've put in, I've just been blocking in larger areas, larger shapes. Same with the tree shapes. Here I'm putting in some of the more neutral green tones along with these the bright green tones. Now I've got a darker value green that I'm working into some of the areas. And I just paint that over top of the lighter green areas. And now I'm just tapping that brush on my hand to create a little bit of splatter of the dark value. Now I'm going to take a liner brush with a very dark value, and I'm building some layers of these branches and twigs, and it helps create this feeling of overlap. So I build layer upon layer, and in the end, once I remove the masking fluid and then I'll paint over that some more, I'll have these layers where I put a dark over top of masked area so the line was broken up and it looks like it's running behind. And then after I take the masking fluid off, I'll put more over top of that, so I have the suggestion that some of these marks are going over top the lighter marks. So I'll have light linear marks going over dark areas, and dark linear marks going over light areas, and light linear marks, and just create this feeling of overlap and depth and texture that gives the suggestion of this area with lots of trees and branches. And but I'm doing it without sitting down and trying to render every little branch and leaf. I'm trying to create textures and suggest my interpretation of this photo. I'm taking a dark neutral value, and I'm trying to do a better job of defining these trees. And I've got a 1/2 inch flat brush that I'm painting with, and you can see that I'm using the side of the brush. I'm not using the tip of the brush. I'm dragging it dragging the side along the surface of the paper. Here I'm starting to define some of these rock shapes a bit more with a darker value. I've blocked in these rock shapes with a neutral wash that's made them a bit darker and kind of one big shape. And now I'm going to start to remove the masking fluid. One thing about working with is when you start to remove the masking fluid, some of the areas that looked somewhat done before you removed it now look less finished because of the area that had been preserved. You're actually painting over top of some of the masking fluid, which kind of gave the impression of some areas that had been toned down and might have been complete, but they really weren't. They were just covered with masking fluid. So once you remove all this masking fluid, especially when there's this much masking, you realize that still have quite a ways to go. Now I've got my bright green tone, actually almost yellow in some areas, but I'm painting these shapes that have been left behind by the masking fluid. And this helps create the sensation of light filtering through all the branches and the leaves and makes it feel sunlit. When I use this approach in doing a snow scene, I wait up to the very end of the painting and I remove the masking fluid. I don't do much painting after that, and what's revealed is snow-covered areas. But in this situation, I'm doing a spring scene, so a lot of those areas that have been preserved by the masking fluid are being painted over, in this case by this nice bright yellow-green. And now, because I preserved a lot of that area around the water with masking fluid and masked off shapes for the leaves, now I can just come back in and put a wash over those areas that were masked, and it gives the suggestion of this mass of leaves hanging off the tree and the branches. I put a little bit of hooker's green in this mixture to give it just a different color or a different tint. A lot of the leaf and foliage and the composition is up in the top here. And up here I've also used this combination of the more yellow green with the cad yellow and permanent green #1. And here is an example where I'm putting on the mixture that's been tinted a bit with the hooker's green. Just as I had come in with the green mixture and painted over the areas that had been protected by the mask, I'm doing the same here with a light valued warm neutral, and I'm putting that tone over top these areas that are these linear marks that represent the branches and the twigs. And I'm painting them in some instances like they're a big shape of a combination of these linear marks as they overlap, but I can just put this glaze over top the whole area. Now I'll come in with dark values and start painting some of these linear shapes with this dark value. And you can see I start and stop my brush and pick it up where there's overlap. And throughout this whole composition of branches and sticks and tree trunks, there's lots of overlap, there's lots of light, there's lots of dark. Still doing more dark brushwork here. Now I switch to a smaller liner brush here, and this area up in the tree has a lot of twigs and thin branches sticking off the main branches, so I don't want to keep painting with the same width brush, just to have a variety of the linear marks that I'm making. And you can see these are much thinner than the brush marks I was making before. Here I'm just going to put a few dark marks on the edge of the distant shoreline there to reinforce that that horizontal element in the composition. Here I'm taking a dark value and giving a suggestion of some leaves that are in shadow here. They kind of frame the lighter green areas of foliage. And that's my painting, Spring at Furnace Run. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to join a community of friends and subscribers to Rick Swartz Watercolor, you can search Facebook for Rick Swartz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers, a new Facebook group. For questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page of my website, rsirwitzart.com. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsirwitzart@gmail.com. You can check out more videos on YouTube. You can follow me on Facebook. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like it, share it, and comment.